Welcome, everybody. Welcome to our final class, our final lesson in Run University. This has been a really interesting deep dive into a lot of data. And today is no exception. We know you're going to be really excited to see these results. I know you're going to find a lot of useful information, a lot of meaningful information in here, and stuff that we think you can apply. And of course, perspective from our great panelists today. So thanks for being here today. I'm Abby Goldstein from PMCC. Joyce McDonald, my partner, and Bill Davis, my other partner, are here today. We're really honored to have made this study come to life. And, I've been thinking a lot about the idea that we started this with, which is that we're capturing a moment in time. We're capturing people's feelings and attitudes right now about media and their habits right now. And that the decisions the decisions we make today may last a long time, but the information may not be relevant 5 years from now. But we really are planting seeds for trees under which we may never sit. So this is a moment to think about our long-term history, and the decisions we make based on run findings now are not bad decisions in the long run. They're decisions that are going to pay off for us in the long run. So with that, I'll turn it over to Joyce. Thank you all for being here today, and we're just glad that you're a part of this.
Thank you, Abby. And yeah, I think the main themes of the study are lasting and foundational. And there's so much here, um, but it but it's not complicated. Implementing it will be more complicated than understanding it. Anyway, okay. Hello and welcome, everybody. Thanks for saying hi in the chat. Um, Few things to note before we get started. You know I'm going to say it because I always do. Please put your questions in the Q&A box and your comments, anecdotes, and thoughts in the chat box. And we hope to have some time at the end for questions. We'll be keeping an eye on incoming questions for sure. Closed captions are enabled, and you can adjust your caption settings in the Zoom menu bar. This webinar is being recorded and it will be available along with the slides for on-demand viewing on greaterpublic.org tomorrow. So today we're going to go deep into the Run research results to uncover the most relevant findings for public media news organizations. What does it mean to be local? How do we best build and serve communities? And what are public media news organizations already successfully doing to meet audiences where they are? A reminder for everybody, as Abby said, this is the final course in the Run University. There is a Run 101 webinar recording, along with 3 deep dive Run session recordings and other materials that explore Run findings on fundraising, marketing, and music, all posted for your viewing and reading pleasure on greaterpublic.org. So let us now hand the reins over to Chris and Phil from City Square Associates, along with Ashley Alvarado from Texas Public Radio, Rachel Estabrook from Colorado Public Radio, and Megan Garvey from LAist. Welcome, everybody.
Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are. I'm Chris Schiavone, president of City Square Associates, and
I'm Phil Cook, research director at CSA.
we are also joined by our colleague, Vivian Harris, who is here to serve as a monitor of the question box and a facilitator of whatever conversation comes out of the Q&A a little bit later on. I want to say a special word of thanks to Ashley and Rachel and Megan for joining us. One of the great pleasures of preparing for Run University has been the business of taking the findings from this research and marrying it together with real live practitioners in the field. And I'm hoping that some of you who've already seen some of the results from the research will notice that the marrying of actual practice with theoretical research has turned out to be a really positive and enriching thing. As Joyce mentioned, this is the last week in our 4.5 week Run University series, and the thumbnails on the screen show you all the other great folks from the public media system who have participated in the work. You will also note that there is an additional session this coming Wednesday, which is billed as a workshop. It's a 90-minute rather than a 1-hour session, which is a more highly interactive version of what we're doing here today. So if you want to come back for that, great. But if you have others on your own teams or people that you know in the industry, please remind them that that is available as well. Our goals for today are pretty straightforward. We want to provide a deep dive into the Run findings insofar as they apply in the news space and could help inform your audience development strategies or your own content strategies. But as I said before, I think we're really making an effort here to marry the data from the research with the experience of your colleagues. And we are hoping that Ashley, Rachel, and Megan interrupt us frequently throughout the next hour. We've organized the learning in 4 zones of interest. First, the craving for more local storytelling. If you've been following the initial findings from Run, you know that this has been a big theme, and we're going to go deeper on just what local storytelling looks like, thanks to the Run research and the experience of our panelists. Then we're going to talk about the appetite for in-depth journalism. We're going to talk about the trust gap, which I think most of you have probably thought about or read about, and the research has some light to shed on that issue. And finally, we're going to end on a hopeful note. And I think we'd all agree this is a time where a little hopefulness would probably go a long way. All right, let's begin by talking a little bit about the craving for local storytelling that was uncovered by the research. And to get into this topic, we want to share a bit of video that was gathered during focus groups that Vivian conducted on our behalf several months ago. You know, when all of you, I think, are aware, the Run study has as its core this massive body of responses from an aggregate sample of over 30,000 American adults. But as wonderful as this robust survey research is and was, there were certain questions and issues where we really felt the need to go back and talk to real live people in real time and find out what they meant. So I want to play this little snippet just to get us started here.
I work in education, and there are like schools closing, and they're moving and overcrowding classrooms, moving them to buildings. So like, I would personally rather talk about that in these types of events and not like the national election.
I like the idea of taking sort of a big picture idea, something that's happening nationally or globally, and then drilling down to what does it mean for this community.
I'm interested in history, especially local history or regional history.
A podcast on local issues that provides different perspectives would be pretty valuable.
Just to be able to find stuff that's happening maybe within a 20-minute walking distance would be really nice, because I'm often traveling an hour on the train to Brooklyn to do other things, but to have a hyper-local calendar would be great.
Part of the reason I listen to local news so religiously is because I like hearing about local events.
I'd like to be able to read more in-depth local stories that are missing, you know, and the city has a deep range of those, you know.
I think you're aware of the fact that in the Run study, every time we tried to measure the unmet need in an area, we took 2 passes at it. We first asked people what they were interested in, and then went back for all the things they told us they were interested in and asked them what they thought there was too much of, what they thought there was just the right amount of, and what they thought there wasn't enough of. And this is the point in the study where it becomes clear to us that things happening in my own city, town, or neighborhood is the top unmet need. Local story is the most the most pressing unmet need. And listening to those folks in the focus groups talk, I think you get a little bit of a sense of what's on their mind when they're talking about things happening in my own city, town, or neighborhood. Yes, it may be very serious issues like education and local politics that no one else is covering, but it could also involve events in the community and ways to become more connected with one's neighbor or ways to get involved. I would love for each of our panelists to speak for a little bit for a moment about what things happening in my own city, town, or neighborhood has looked like in their own news practices. Any of you can start off. Ashley, do you want to lead the way?
Sure. When I look at this, part of what I think about, and those who've worked with me in the past have heard me say this many times, but so often we're hoping for relevance and there's an opportunity to design for it. And so it's taking the information that we have here, especially when you do the localized versions, to see what opportunities you have in your own community to best serve it. And something in my move from Southern California to Texas has been really interesting for me to think about and work with our newsroom is understanding what this means in that capacity. And so in Southern California, you would look at how stories about other parts of California performed on the LAist website, and you could see that distinction between what felt local and what felt statewide or national. And then in Texas, stories about other parts of Texas perform really, really well. And so I appreciate the ability to sort of have that definition that you go with that works for you, but then also to super serve that need and to see how it distinguishes what you're doing. I'll also note that we're in the process of starting to redesign one of our websites, and this understanding of what's happening here, how do I navigate San Antonio, is the primary driver of what we're doing.
Yeah, that's really cool, Ashley. I think Ashley, I've heard you talk about working smarter rather than harder when it comes to doing this.
I like efficiencies and cliches.
Rachel, I think you have an insight as to what this looks like that has arisen from your production of the daily podcast that you all have in Colorado.
Yeah, we've gotten a really strong affirmation of what the folks in that video montage were saying. We launched essentially a local version of Up First, where we do 3 to 4 stories a day in under 15 minutes. We launched it in the winter, and the feedback we've gotten really does echo a lot of what you just heard. We make the third story in the show every day, something about local happenings, something about a curiosity or, a new theater season or new music or oddball sort of events going on. And across the board, when we talk to listeners, they comment on that aspect of the podcast and how much they love it. So that's been really cool. And another thing that you might have heard in the music portion of the Run research was about how uplifting music really resonates with people. And we've taken that to heart even on the news side, that when we do share music, we make sure that it has a sort of uplift quality to it. And people seem to really like that. And along with that, they also you can see in the metrics of the podcast that the stories that localize national Trump events, happenings, developments are the ones that get the most clicks in the podcast. So that's been a new metric for us that's really interesting to see, particularly stories that localize and explain the local impact of immigration enforcement. And so I think on both those fronts, those have been really strong indicators of what the Run research also confirmed.
Yeah, that's those two last points you made, Rachel, are a wonderful preview of a couple of themes that are coming up shortly, one in about 3 slides and one later in the deck. But that's really, really helpful. Megan, I'm going to ask you to speak to this next one in a moment, because this reinforces the fact that this interest in local storytelling bridges the political divide, right? You see that whether someone is very or somewhat conservative or very or somewhat liberal, this topic area is still the top unmet need in a way that some other topics are not, right? But this is a topic area that seems to bring people together instead of dividing them apart.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that there are, regardless of where people fall along the political spectrum, like typically they don't like corruption, right? They don't like to feel like things are the public officials are doing wrong. We've had over the last year and a half a long running story about corruption in Orange County, which is the next county down from LA County and a part of our coverage area. Ultimately, we uncovered $13 million in taxpayer money that basically was diverted away from helping people to enrich a politician in his sort of circle. And that was something that was well received regardless of party affiliation. The official happens to be Republican, although he was a county supervisor, so his party was not really super front and center. But we definitely heard from people across the political spectrum that they wanted to know what was going on and that they felt that that was incredibly valuable reporting that had been done. And so that really did cross the spectrum. I'll also say, at LAS, we've done a lot of work to understand audience needs. We've done, as Ashley knows, because we worked together for 7 years until very recently. And, we went out to the community, we asked them like what was top of mind. And I've really rearranged a lot of how we're using our resources in the newsroom around that. I mean, we had like one person covering homelessness. We didn't have anyone covering really housing issues. And now we have about, 5 to 6 people on the staff who are spending a good portion, if not all of their time looking at that because we heard over and over again from people that that was the top issue here in Southern California, affordability of living here. And so we were able to go back to our major gifts team and get a health job recast as an intersection of health and homelessness because of course where you live affects your health, right? We were able to add capacity on our investigative watchdog unit, looking specifically at that. And that was a direct result of really listening not only to what they told us, because people sometimes tell you things that might not actually come to pass, but also really looking at where people were reading, which is easier to see right than what people are listening to. And just to echo Rachel, we've had a very successful, we call it the LA Report. We do it twice daily, local podcast, and across the whole podcast world, on-demand world for us, that has been like really a consistent audience that is going to that, subscribing to that particular show. And I think it's been quite successful to deliver that news in an on-demand space to a local audience here who seems to want it. And that market has gotten, there used to be other shows in that space, including the LA Times and some other like smaller newsrooms. And I don't know that there are any of them left. So having that consistency there, I think is a real benefit to our the Southern California audience.
Megan made that point about content and programming around homelessness and health. And this is just, a reminder that, as much commonality as there is across markets, here you're seeing all of the local markets where we did local market oversampling in every single market. Things happening in my city, town, or neighborhood is at the very top of the list. But interest in some other topic areas does vary from market to market to market. And there's something sort of intuitive about the fact that in Los Angeles, the topic of homelessness as an area of unmet need pops in a way that it might not in other parts of the country. And some of you who are in this meeting may actually be in one of the markets where we did local market oversampling, and you can interrogate your own data pretty closely. But you'll also be able, with the help of the national dashboard, be able to interrogate some of the data, at least for your region or your state, a little more closely. What's cool about this local storytelling as an unmet need is that it's already considered a public radio strength, right? What you're seeing here, in the survey, we not only asked people what they were interested in or what they thought they needed more of, but then for all those things they told us they were interested in and wanted more of, we went back and asked them, do you think that this is the kind of thing that public radio might, in particular, be good at providing? And the only other topic topics on this list that folks seem to think public radio would be better suited to report on are climate and the environment, which was also an extremely popular topic in the study, and social justice, which is less popular in the general population, but still considered to be a public radio strength. So local storytelling presses all the buttons here. I was mentioning the local market oversamples. We were really happy to have Utah, KUER, involved in the local market oversampling. And their data was really, really interesting because what respondents were asked to do in the survey was to take these different geographies of news coverage, news about your city and town, national news, across the state, international news, and so on, right? And arrange them in rank order from most to least interesting personally. And when you do this analysis, you see how different members of the general public are in the main from KUER's own constituents, its members, and its known listeners. Nearly 40% of the general public ranked news about your own town or city as the geographical zone of interest, of greatest interest to them. Only 18% of the KUER constituents ranked news about your own city or town as their top interest. Half of them had national news ranked as their top interest. So really being aware of the fact that there might be this delta between what members of the community at large value and what your own sort of known members and listeners value is going to be really, really important for audience development. In Pittsburgh, we asked a similar kind of question. We asked people here about whether each of these different kinds of coverage would make them any more likely to use WESA as a news source. And here, by a long stretch, you see that covering local news stories that no one else was covering, more news from my own city or town, these were at the very top of the ranker. Earlier on, Rachel was talking about providing the local angle on national headlines. We went back into the national survey data and did a little bit of extra statistical analysis to see if there was any kind of relationship between the unmet needs that people identified, in one part of the survey and other unmet needs they had identified or other characteristics that they have personally or demographically. The one we were looking at in particular was this one as a characteristic of news, that it provides local context to national issues. I think, Rachel, that's what you were describing you're doing in your daily podcast. What's interesting is 26% of the population say this is important and there's not enough of it. But see how this correlates with other unmet needs that people expressed. It correlates pretty highly with wanting more news that reflects opinions they don't usually hear. It correlates pretty strongly with wanting more news that sheds light on the good things happening on the world. It correlates pretty strongly with wanting more news that they can trust. Notice what it doesn't correlate very strongly with. It doesn't correlate very strongly with household income or degree of urbanness or ruralness or generational differences. I mean, I think, many of us have been trained to believe how does the saying go, that demography is destiny, right? That someone's demographic characteristics determine who they're going to be and what they're going to be interested in. But in this case, at least, demography doesn't have a lot to do with it. People who are interested in what they're interested in also have another set of interests, all of which I think you'll agree fall very much within the realm of public radio to address. One of the things that we were really monitoring closely in the survey was how people's news needs relate to the particular situation of the geographies in which they live. A lot of us have read the literature and heard the press about news deserts, and we did our own identification of news deserts in our research by identifying for each respondent in the study whether they lived in a local news media rich zone, with 11 or more local news sources available to them, or in a zone where there's really a lack of local news coverage with as few as no local media sources besides their local public radio station to as many as 5 or so. And so when you look at this map, you really get a sense of the geographical spread of those parts of the country with few or no local news sources. Now, obviously, the dark gray bubbles are in the places that you would expect. Southern California, the Northeast corridor from Boston all the way down to Philadelphia. You might think that this means that there's no special needs for local news in those areas. Megan, the expression on your face tells me maybe that's not necessarily true, at least in a place like LA.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure this is true in other big urban areas, but nearly 1 in 30 Americans lives in LA County. So we've got whole communities. There's 88 cities in LA County. We've got whole communities that have barely had a journalist in them in years. So I mean, I think it's a chronic problem across the US, but even in areas that look covered, I think that there are both opportunities and shortfalls. I mean, I was just we had a convening last week of some of the foundations, and someone from the Broad who I used to work with at the LA Times made the point that the LA Times won a Pulitzer for covering Bell, like the city of Bell, which is a tiny little city along one of the highways here. And then she asked the question, did they ever go back? And I don't know that they did, so even when things get like a national spotlight on them, there might not be consistent coverage. And I do think that public media hopefully is positioned to try to take that into consideration and think a little bit differently about how we approach coverage.
That is such a great point, Megan, and I think our data sort of bears that out. Well, here you're seeing sort of the correlation between an area's degree of urbanness or ruralness and the number of local news outlets available to them. There is a correlation, but it's not perfect, meaning that there are rural or somewhat rural districts that actually have multiple news sources, and there are urban districts that do not. So understanding that this isn't just a rural need is a really, really important thing. That said, good to acknowledge the fact that going back to the prime unmet need, more information about things happening in my own city, town, or neighborhood. It's high everywhere, but not surprisingly, it's highest in those places among those people who have the fewest local media sources available to them. We made a real point in preparing for Run University to see how our research was or was not consistent with the work that other folks out in the field have been doing in the same topic zone. I don't know if any of you have ever run across this piece from the Shorenstein Center by Thomas Patterson, who actually conducted a study of 253 NPR member stations to learn more about their local news operations and their degree of investment in the space and what it would take to succeed there. The article is worth a read in its entirety, but what stood most out to us is the claim that he makes that local public radio stations are uniquely positioned right now to do the work. Relatively speaking, you may not all be feeling this day to day, but relatively speaking, the cost involved in achieving the kind of reach that the typical local public radio station is able to achieve, not to mention digital distribution, is really amazing, together with the level of trust that people seem to place in their local public media organization. So really strong vote of support coming from an independent source. Finally, in the spirit of deeper analysis, as we're talking about the different kinds of topics that you could be covering on your air and online, we looked at people's interests in all the different topics we presented to them, and then looked for clusters, like really what this chart is telling you is that people who are interested in X also tend to be interested in Y and Z. And this kind of information is really important because it helps you as folks who are, programming and assigning reporters and trying to develop audiences, how you can sort of build an audience around clusters of interest. Now, local information correlates most strongly with weather and crime, and I don't think anyone who's watched a local television newscast didn't already.
They're pretty foundational, I think.
Right? But what we want you to see is the way some of the other subject matter works together. How coverage of housing interacts with social justice coverage and climate coverage, how covering of immigration interacts with politics and the economy. People who seek out one topic in a cluster are also likely to seek out one or more of the others in the cluster. And that also is a key for unlocking the value of some of this data.
Yeah. All right, on to the next one. So another theme from the study pointing in the direction of unmet needs had to do with news formats. And here there was pretty compelling evidence that people are looking for more investigative reporting that reflects depth and careful research. Here are the results from that unmet needs line of questioning. Again, we presented respondents with this range of formats and we asked, which are you most drawn to and which do you also want more of? So at the top of the list, there's that option specifically phrased in-depth stories brought to light through investigative reporting. This was a need expressed regardless of source or platform or medium, but we then followed up again to ask which of these feel like the kind of thing you would turn to public radio for. In-depth stories right up there alongside interviews with people affected by the issues involved and interviews with subject matter experts. This extra lens was helpful for us and thinking about this through the perspective of audience development because this shouldn't be seen as prescriptive in the sense of telling you what you can or can't do, but it does give you a sense of what people in the general public are primed to expect from you. So they don't necessarily expect you to deliver, for example, commentary and opinion from people they quote unquote like and trust. That's sort of in that red zone. But they do expect these things in the green zone. Again, interviews and in-depth stories from investigative reporting. So I'll pause there, Megan. I'll turn to you first because you had mentioned this new watchdog team that you have found some success with, especially around kind of fundraising efforts.
Yeah, so we were fortunate enough to be part of this local news initiative that's going on here in Southern California. So I was able to make 3 hires into a watchdog team over basically this calendar year. And the goal there was to really bring people in, and this is not like an old-fashioned investigative team where, people go away for a year and come back with one story, which I think we all know is quite expensive and has all kinds of other things that go along with it that could be problematic, particularly if you're running a smaller newsroom. Even for a newsroom of my size, which is, well, bigger than many, not massive. And so we brought those folks in with the expectation that they would be doing stories like that, and the editor says you have to do stories to get stories, which I think is true. But even before we were able to make that investment, last year as part of our goal setting, I made for everyone who's working in the content space, one of their goals to have active public records requests. And this is all with the intention of being able to produce truly original and distinctive journalism that doesn't exist elsewhere. And we have found that to be absolutely critical to our ability to find a younger, more diverse audience, also to have a reputation and an audience outside of just the NPR listening audience. So folks who are tuning to us because they're primarily really NPR fans. We have not found here in Southern California that republishing NPR stories like on our website is really moving the needle for us. It really is that those original stories that we are doing. And what we have found over the course of the last couple of years is, and it took a while to get here, but where now, like, if, I think a lot of folks are probably aware that the LA Times has had a series of difficulties. Um, but people are looking for an alternative, and people like organically are saying go to LAist. Like if you look at, LAist, we're doing like we are focused, we have clarity on what we are covering. We are covering Southern California. We are trying to be helpful to people in Southern California. We're trying to do original reporting you're not going to find anywhere else in Southern California. And I think I just want to say one other thing about that. Earlier you were talking about, like the idea that demographics is destiny. And, when Ashley was still here, we did a human-centered design project that was around people's needs. And the truth is, like, regardless of who you are, where you came from, your level of income, your education, we all have many of the same needs, right? And if we're trying to meet those needs rather than trying to just speak specifically to like niche communities, you can actually serve an audience across a lot of those demographic lines in a way that's more meaningful and more specific to your audience. So for us, I think that the great, tragedy, I don't know exactly what to say. The problem in American journalism right now is that there's less and less of it, right? And so this old system of where you just match what someone else was doing, like none of us can afford that anymore. And a lot of us aren't even in communities anymore where you can rely on your local print newspaper to be covering the basic news. Because a lot of TV and radio, let's be honest, copied the local print newspaper, right? They turned to the local print newspaper to know what was news. And I think we're kind of on our own here. So we need to have strategies for making sure that we're doing that kind of reporting, building skill sets so that we know how to do it, and then communicating back out to our audience what makes us special. And I think the more you can say you would not know about this if it was not for my newsroom, the better off we are in terms of funding and in terms of audience.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the strategies you brought up actually preempt something we found having done another regression analysis on this particular unmet need, where we saw that it actually predicted some of these things that people say that they want more of by way of attributes of stories, specifically local stories. So they want not just carefully researched news, but more stories that others aren't covering, or more news about unusual and surprising topics. So we're hoping this also kind of gives you a little bit more practical guidance on the kinds of things to cover in this kind of a format with depth and with investigative journalism. Also, again, like the last regression, we saw a lot of weak correlations with demographic attributes. So it's not really that specific kinds of people want these things, but it's more sort of news consumer profiles more so. Megan, I'm going to turn it right back to you to tell us a little bit more about how LAist is doing this on the front with regards to different kinds of audiences, digital and radio.
Yeah, I mean, I really just want to make the sense that the point here that this strategy is working for us at least. And so essentially what we have here is this concept of 3 areas. And I'm going to acknowledge that my newsroom is big enough to do this, but we want to be present on daily news. That's for breaking news. Obviously, we had the fires in January. We've had these protests more recently, that we need to do that original journalism I just talked about. And that we also have this concept of Explore LA, and that's more on the fun side. That's the best things to do newsletter and story that has, performed well for us for years. That's a sense of fun. We just had a story over the weekend about our weekend editor found this cola called Los Angeles that's being made in Japan and acquired some of it and did a taste test on it. That's like what we would think of as like a connect story, where it's something that people can come together and have a shared experience. I put these graphs up here to show that as we've really leaned into this concept, you'll see that huge spike right in January. That's the January fires here, which obviously, we had a big audience on, I think partly because our strategy is to be as helpful as possible. But what I want to note here is that audience has remained high. So that was like the tide rose and we stayed at the higher tide. There was a new baseline. And you'll see that correspond pretty closely with what happened on the radio side too. So providing this level of local coverage, I think, has moved the needle for us, certainly on digital. On digital, this is primarily just local news. On radio, obviously, it's a combination of national news. And I think that, there are people who have tuned back into what's going on with the Trump administration, but it's also our coverage of local news. So I just want to say that this is a combination that can help us. And on the strategic partner side, we do lean in. We do republish some NPR, not that much, but some. And we have other local partners in California, like notably Cal Matters, and other local newsrooms that we republish their content. And to what I said before, that's because we don't have it doesn't make sense for us just to match other people's coverage. Like we can cover more ground if we lean into what our local partners are doing or statewide partners are doing. So I really encourage, even in last protest, we really had good coordinated meetings where we're like, if Cal Matters is going to have a story about whether this is even legal or not to take over the National Guard like this, I'm not going to assign one of my reporters to do that. I'm going to put my reporter on a story about, what's actually happening in the middle of the protest, or whether the police are obeying like their revised media rules and things like that. So
yeah, I feel like this is really cool kind of proof of concept. You're actually seeing real results from your efforts.
Megan, sorry to interrupt. Just say there's a question about what the top graph refers to, and then I think it would be neat for you to point out what Eagles refers to in that also.
So I'm laughing. The part where the numbers. So that's I had to pull the top days for the fire out of the graphic because otherwise you couldn't see anything else. They were so high. Those numbers were twice anything else on this graphic. And the eagles. So there were eagle eggs laid in January. And last year there were 2 eggs and neither of them hatched, and it was kind of really sad for everyone here. It was something a lot of folks here were following. So the eagles refer to the fact the eagles eggs being laid and then the eagles hatching, and just recently they have fledged, which is first flight, and there was another spike there. And that's a classic connect story in the sense that like it brought people together to have a shared experience.
That's so cool. We actually have bald eagles in the cemetery by our house here in the Boston area, and it has been like the biggest community convener to like watch the eagles.
Yeah.
All right. All right. One last dimension that's worth adding here, which was this kind of implicit role of investigative journalism at the local level, specifically as a democratic institution. This is from a series of attitude statements from the survey. Here, over half of respondents agree or strongly agree that this kind of coverage is an important way to help preserve democracy. It's pretty telling to us that the majority of Americans feel this way, 55%. But it seems to be even more pervasive among certain demographics that you see in the box. So you see this is over-indexing with people who identify as liberal, who are highly educated and relatively affluent. These are the kinds of people we know are already more likely to consume public media, and they feel especially strong about this connection between journalism and democracy. We covered this in a lot more depth earlier in the series about fundraising, because this has a lot of value for really activating and motivating these kinds of listeners to financially support. We also think it's important to keep in mind for thinking about kind of the bigger picture reasons for providing this kind of coverage. Yes, it's an unmet need for consumers of news and current events, but it's also a not insignificant amount of people out there seem to also value it for its broader social and political service. All right, our third theme covers something I'm sure you're all familiar with, as Chris mentioned. This has to do with the extent to which people trust or don't trust different sources of news and information in their own little media worlds. Again, another attitude statement from the survey. This one had the strongest level of agreement. 3/4 of respondents from across the country said they're concerned about the accuracy and reliability of news that they come across these days. This seems especially true for older folks and the college educated. I surmise that these are people who already over-index on frequency of news consumption, so they probably just have more data points to choose from in their minds about this issue. But it's also telling that this seems to be another point of agreement between liberals and conservatives. So this distrust is not a symptom of people occupying very specific media bubbles that reflect a particular partisan slant. It is pervasive across the country. No surprise then, we saw this when evaluating news characteristics through that unmet needs lens. Again, we asked which of these attributes they find important, and then followed up again with the sense of how much of that kind of news is available to them currently. At the top of the ranker, a widespread sense of importance and need for news that is, quote, something they can trust. And then closely behind in second place, tying back to the last section, this need for news and information that is carefully researched. And you see these particular attributes also emerge as public radio strengths in the sense that people said they'd actually consider public radio a go-to source for that kind of storytelling. Less popular down the ranker, news coverage that is different kinds of being opinion-based, or it being agreeable, or it being provocative. Zooming back into another local market where we fielded some custom run questions. Here is the data from Colorado, among Colorado residents from across the state. We got a read on what people wish was more available to them here in the context of local news and information. So with some of these options, we see some moderate appeal for different kinds of specific formats or platforms of consumption. But at the top of the list, very specifically, a need for sources that they consider trustworthy, with 54% of Colorado residents wanting more of this. And in second place, another callback actually to the last two sections, in-depth coverage of issues affecting their local neighborhoods. Zooming now to Florida, in Jacksonville, we got some clues into what may be driving this kind of trust deficit, or where there may be the most potential for building audiences by leveraging some existing trust equity. Here was an attitude statement that seems to really get to the heart of the matter, with localism being a possible solution. Half of local area residents from the Jacksonville area said that they're more likely to trust a local news source than a national or international news source. And that was something even more pronounced among conservatives from the area, parents, and native Floridians.
Ashley, did you, do I remember correctly that you saw a recent piece of research that sheds an interesting light on this with younger audiences?
Yes, I had the opportunity recently to help roll out some research from RTDNA and Maggot focused on trust in local news with younger news consumers. And one of the things that I found interesting there, first of all, they're talking specifically about 18 to 34-year-olds and who presented as skeptical of journalism, of news, generally speaking. But they talked about seeing, and I'm looking at it to make sure I don't introduce misinformation. 63% of those surveyed said that there is false or disinformation, at least somewhat prevalent in local news, which is different from some of what I've heard more regularly in conversations of local news. But what was really striking to me is that of those surveyed, 45%, when asked the question, who should be most responsible for preventing the spread of false or disinformation, who should be part of identifying and debunking misinformation, 45% of those same news consumers pointed to local news outlets and journalists. And so, whether the problem is national or even regional and local, they see the solution and the opportunity being at the local level, and that it's the responsibility of local journalists.
Yeah, like an expectation of accountability. Almost.
Exactly.
We should include that in the bibliography.
Yeah, we will.
So that was from Jacksonville. That was one attitude statement, but we paired it with other attitude statements that fold in the public radio dimension to this topic and how the national public radio brand of NPR plays into this. So that top statement, you see a slight majority of locals from the Jacksonville area find NPR to be a valuable source for news. But with those other statements, much less likely to rank it exceptionally high for trust. And it was interesting to gauge this kind of thing in a market like Jacksonville, as opposed to like LA or New York, given its mixed political environment. So I want to close here with some other studies with this exact kind of thing was seen in research from Pew, who fielded this particular study actually a couple months ago in the context of the public media funding debate. No surprise that Republicans are much less likely to use or trust content from each of the national brands, PBS and NPR. However, last year, Pew also did a study very specifically about people's perceptions of local news. And here, a huge majority of Americans, 85%, say local news outlets are at least somewhat important to the well-being of their local community. Not only that, you see how a majority view local news media overall pretty favorably in a lot of different ways here in the chart. They see it as reporting news accurately, covering the most important issues, being transparent, and on that theme of accountability, holding local elected officials accountable in their reporting. And then when you add on that political lens, it turns out that a majority of Americans affiliated with both parties agree with this particular sentiment. So there's leaning into your local identity and covering stories that matter to people in their own communities is something that can have a real impact on serving this need for trustworthy sources of news. And I'll end with another reference out here to the Trust Project. They developed a prescriptive framework, set of standards for how news consumers can evaluate the credibility of news that they're using themselves. They also did some of their own audience research a while back, which demonstrated real impact of these standards. Users in this study said that they were more likely to positively evaluate those news sources and said that they would seek news out from them in the future based on those standards. So we have a closing thought on this. This data was from 2017. A lot has changed in the news ecosystem since then. I think these standards that they've put out there are very valuable as an editorial guide for building trust. And they show promise, obviously, for influencing people's perceptions, but it's unclear the extent to which this holds true in the world of 2025 and beyond.
Okay, not just because Joyce asked us to be hopeful, but because the research points us in this direction, we're ending on the theme of hope. I'm going to skip over this in the interest
When I was like a kid.
of time, but that video is actually filled with great little nuggets about how when people are moving out into the media space in 2025, they're out there looking to be uplifted. And even in the news space specifically, they're looking for reasons to hope. There's a reason for that. News fatigue is a thing, and we've been tracking it since at least 2015 or 2016, and it continues to be a strong factor. There are some indications that folks who have had left the water have jumped back into the water in recent months. So if some of you are at stations who have seen increases in your web traffic or in your QUME, we agree that is happening in certain places. But there's also some pretty strong reason to believe that some of what's going on there is not new listeners or new readers. It's folks who had checked out who are checking back in because the situation is so urgent. The overall trends on polarization and the news fatigue that's induced, we're pretty confident continue to be a thing. This may be why, when we gave people a whole set of possible things that they were hoping they'd get out of their news listening or news reading experience, this characteristic of makes me feel hopeful is considered to be the top unmet need, followed by helps me become a better person. People want more hopeful storytelling. What's interesting about it is that while more hopeful storytelling might be a top unmet need, public radio is not necessarily seen as the go-to for that. And I'm just going to go out on a limb and speculate that that might have something to do with the fact that at most public radio stations, a very significant portion of the day is the NPR political news and world news coverage, which may not at first blush create a very hopeful effect. But I think we heard some really, really interesting case studies from both Megan and Rachel about ways in which, I think, Megan, as you put it, you talked about connect stories, and I feel like the story about the LA Cola and about the Eagles are great examples of that, and likewise, Rachel, some of what forms the mix of your daily podcast, right? Like, I think you're both seeing that in your own news content, there's real importance to introducing hopeful storytelling into that. We talked about this in the focus groups. We presented folks with a story concept that we referred to as success stories and asked people to react and respond to it. And what was really interesting here is that it became clear to us is that when people were saying they wanted more hopeful storytelling, they weren't asking for a lot of puff pieces. They were asking for stories that could be inspiring, stories that inspired people or groups that they could participate in, right? Stories about initiatives that make a better world, right? And that's not a puff piece, that's storytelling that's uplifting. I think many of you are probably also familiar with the concept of solutions journalism. So this is storytelling that not only highlights problems, but also makes the effort to shed a bright light or focus on potential solutions to those problems. The Solutions Journalism Network commissioned work with Smith Geiger back in 2021. And the metrics are really, really encouraging for the positive impact on audience development for storytelling that adopts a solutions journalism approach. I think, Rachel, we're going to end with you because I think in some of the climate coverage you all have been doing in Colorado, you've kind of adopted this solutions posture.
Yeah, for a few years now, we've had a dedicated team, an editor, and a few reporters focused on climate and specifically on climate solutions. And I think they've become really, really good at finding the stories that both explain the problem and also are realistic about looking for solutions. So we did this multi-platform series in April called Hotspots about geothermal energy. This is just one example, but it was on all of our platforms from social, digital, radio, podcast, etc. And it was revealing this clean energy source that you probably don't know much, if anything, about, but that is showing promise in Colorado and could be key to meeting our clean energy goals in the state, which are pretty aggressive. And we hooked people in by connecting it with hot springs, which are a favorite tourist attraction here. For out of state, but also in-state tourists. So we got a lot of interest from Coloradans, who is our primary audience, but also from beyond Colorado. And I think it was a good reminder of exactly what you're saying, that people really are hungry, not just for the doom and gloom. And I think we've done it best on our climate team, and it's actually something we could replicate in other beats in the newsroom a little bit better. This idea of not just pointing out problems, but also really searching for solutions. And climate happens to be an area where Colorado is home to a lot of research trying to find solutions. So that's another way that it lets us highlight that.
Yeah, that's great, Rachel. Vivian, I'm going to toss it over to you and give you the impossible task. We have like a 3-minute window here. Did you notice in the question box anything that you can elevate for us to address before we leave?
Thanks, Chris. And thank you, everyone. There were a few very specific questions that came up in the chat. And I want to just thank Ashley and Megan for addressing those questions as they came up. Most of them were about things that were reported on about what LAist was doing. So that was really helpful. There's just one question, Chris. So that's the good news, because we should have time to address it. It has to do, I think this came up rather early, so I think it has to do with that initial ranker of unmet needs. And Anne mentioned that news from around the region was ranked much lower than things happening around my city, town, and neighborhood. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how to parse the difference between local versus regional. And I'll just add that I think there's another nuance here, which is that one of those topics is about news and one is about things happening. So I wonder if you can just sort of help explain why those two things fell at different points in the ranker.
Yeah, so Vivian, you have such a deep knowledge of the research that you already anticipated one of the responses. And you are right, like that category of things happening in my city, town, or neighborhood is gigantic. And as I think both Megan and Rachel made very clear, that is a category that's large enough to include not only news coverage of important issues, but also events and things that involve the way people can be connected in their community, or live music experiences and that kind of thing, right? But the other point, I think, is the point that Ashley, you made, either intentionally or unintentionally, when you were talking about your experience since moving over to Texas, right? Because in Texas, regional, quote unquote, statewide coverage of statewide stories resonates really well. That is not true in every part of the country. And a lot of this has to do with the very distinct psychographics of your region. And I think there's a real imperative there to get to know your region really, really well. In some places, regional or statewide news is really powerful. In other places, not so much, because maybe because the metro area has such a dominant impact, and it's about knowing your region.
Awesome. All right, I'm calling time. I wish we had another hour, but I want to thank so much City Square, Team City Square, for all the great work. And a particular thanks to Rachel and Megan and Ashley for joining us today and talking about what you're doing locally. Again, everybody, there's a ton of stuff posted on greaterpublic.org, so you can keep swimming in the Run River for the rest of the summer. And with that, Abby, Bill, final word.
It's been an interesting series. Thank you, City Square, for making this all happen, and thanks to everybody who's attended. Really, really important information, I think. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks to all of you.
Okay.
Bye,
See you
everyone.
all. Thank you. Bye.